Is this better?
Yeah.
Wonderful.
And here we are. So, hello, everybody. So the students, the speakers, the colleagues from Minerva Lab that has joined us in the meantime. We are here today with Sabrina Marchetti and Giulia Garofalo Geymonat from Ca' Foscari University of Venice. The third co-author, Daniela Cherubini, if I understood correctly, is not joining us. But as you can see, the presentation includes also her, of course, from Milan University Bicocca. I immediately give the floor to Sabrina for a short presentation of their project, and then I think, if I understood correctly, that Giulia will present the rest of the paper, if I understood correctly.
Yes, thank you again. Good evening to everybody. Thank you again to Marcella, Giulia, and everybody who organized this meeting, giving us the opportunity. Once again, I will say for some of the people, but for the first time for the majority of the attendees, to share our work. And in particular, we're going to focus on the results of this project that have been published in a book which has the same title of this cover slide. So Global Domestic Workers, Intersectional Inequalities and Struggles for Rights. But more than a book presentation, what we want to do is to speak about the project as such, this project more in general. Daniela Cherubini indeed is not joining from the beginning, but she said that she might join in the very end because she was teaching herself and she gonna join after class. If that's okay with you, she was happy
Yes, of course.
and
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful.
Yeah.
As you can see already from the first slide, this is a European project. It's very much based on fieldwork, on ethnographic collection of data. This picture that you see on the cover, and all the pictures you're gonna see have been done by myself and the other colleagues through our trips and journeys in the countries under study. This is a picture taken in Taipei, and is a demonstration on migrants' rights more in general, but with a group of domestic workers demonstrated, as you can see, with beautiful labels under the rain. Giulia? Thank you. So for us, it was a very, maybe I should take the time. For us, it was very important to address the issue of domestic work, the issue of domestic workers' rights, embedded in a very feminist framework in which we see our domestic work more in general, what we can call social reproduction work, has been stigmatized through history for being a dirty activity, for being naturally associated with women carrying these positions. And this sort of association, I don't know how much you're familiar with feminist debates on the social construction of domestic cleaning, mothering work, all these type of jobs. So the domestic workers, paid domestic workers, so women who do this job as their main economic activity, of course, are positioned in a very vulnerable position due to the overlap between different regimes of stigmatizations and discrimination. One is the gendered discrimination on all the caring and social reproduction activity. The others can be discriminations based on their background as being migrants, for being ethnic minorities, for being racialized people, or we also have India, so it is important to speak about caste, or more in general, many of them are women from poorly educated backgrounds, working class backgrounds. So what we can see is that if you want to generalize, in most of the countries in the world, when you look at the kind of people who do domestic work as their job, so not as a private activity, but as their main occupation, we are going to see that these are people that are in a very, let's say, low-level, stigmatized, vulnerable social position. And domestic work is one of the few opportunities they have, together with other very connotated jobs, to make their living. Domestic workers have also been discussed as a very difficult target group for trade unionists, for syndicalization, for claiming rights, because of the representation of domestic workers as being very isolated, very divided, each of them, let's say, isolated in the home of the employer with very few opportunities for socialization and, gathering with other workers. So very probably the opposite of the factory setting that we can imagine as the perfect, fertile setting for unionization and politicization of workers. We actually are going to show you, as this is not has not been so true in recent years. Domestic workers have been able, despite those kind of difficulties, have been able to still gather, unionize, and have a collective voice, very strong collective voice. So we are playing, let's say, with those tensions, trying to understand not so much the conditions of these workers. I mean, the conditions of these workers, we know them, have been studied at length in all the countries that we address. We have plenty of studies that supported us in the description of the condition and specific features of domestic work in each of these countries. But what we wanted to see for us is more the agency, if you want, of these workers, the way they gather and they unionize in order to claim a better position, a better social position, and better legal rights at the same time, legal labor rights, to be more precise. As you can see at the bottom of this slide, in which probably we put a lot of contents, as you can see at the bottom, we were very lucky because we could concentrate in a very special moment of this history that I just told you, is the history of the preparation, promulgation, ratification, and first implementation of a very important labor provision, legal provision on labor rights, which is a convention of the ILO. ILO, as you may know, is the International Labour Organization based in Geneva, but with a global scope, and they promote conventions for the rights of all categories of workers. And in 2011, they launched a convention on the rights of domestic workers as deserving more dignity, they would say, as workers. We were able to observe, because the project started in 2016, so 5 years after the launch of this convention, we were able to assess the first impact of this convention at the national right, but also to recollect with our interviewees what have been the steps to prepare for this convention. Okay, so we actually focus, as we highlight there at the bottom, on a 10 years time, which is preparation, promulgation, ratification, and first implementation. Next slide, please.
Scusatemi.
Sì, perché...
Oh. Vado avanti, Sabri?
Il team forse c'era prima.
No, è dopo.
Yes, okay, but it's fine. So that before was a picture of the domestic workers, the activists we are talking about. We'll come back to them. Here, just yes, this is a very nice picture of activists, the organizers of domestic workers groups that we met in the different locations like Colombia, but we have also pictures from UK, Mexico, and the EU Parliament in Brussels, just to give a glimpse, an image of the people we are talking about. So next slide. Again, this is other people, is some of the women that compose our research team, which, as you can see from the list of names, was very broad. We had a co-team made by myself, Giulia Garofalo, Geymonat, and Daniela Cherubini, the other authors of the book, but also Anna Di Bartolomeo, based in Italy, as a core team analyzing all the material that we gathered. And then we had 9 researchers, the country experts, as we call them, that were working for 1 year for us, or with us, I would say, in order to collect the ethnographic data at the national level. After 1 year of research at the national level, we gather everything together and we started analyzing. Next slide, maybe. This is the type of work we do now, so gatherings, but also in this picture you can see a tension between the archival work that we did looking at the past. This is a picture from the 60s in Italy, when there was a hype of the domestic workers movements in Italy was during that time. And the other picture is a picture of pictures. So it's a moment, it's a picture I made myself, it's a moment in which we were talking with the domestic workers, the activists for domestic workers' rights, asking them to talk about their activities. And they have shown us this beautiful poster with all the photos that they keep as a good memory of the moments in which they met at the international level. So this is a regional meetings in Latin America at the Latin American level, let's say regional level in that sense. Next slide. So as I said, we did interviews, in-depth interviews with key informants, but we also observed many gatherings, many meetings. Some of our country experts did a really in-depth participatory observation as a type of ethnography. We collected statistical data. In some cases, especially in Italy, it was important to work in the archive because, as I mentioned before, the most intense period of mobilization for domestic workers' rights was back in the past, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, not so much today, I must say. And also the last one is important because in each of these countries, we had a workshop, and us from Italy, we traveled to those countries in order to join the workshop. At the workshop were invited some of the same key informants that the country experts had interviewed already or were about to interview. And so it was for us an opportunity to meet the same people that participated in our research as interviewees, but also we spent maybe some days or in some cases a couple of weeks with the country expert and discussing the project, discussing the first outcomes and results. So it was a very important also moment of critical reflection on how the project was going. Next slide. This is just a quick screen, let's say, list of the type of ethnographic data. So as you can see, almost 200 interviews in all the 9 countries. So the 9 countries, probably I didn't say that we don't have the map. We usually have a map, but you can see maybe they're from the they are here, right? Colombia, Ecuador, Brazil. So 3 countries in Latin America, then India, Philippines, and Taiwan, 3 countries in Asia, and Spain, Germany, and Italy, 3 countries in Europe, with very different stories, with very different trajectories. So for us, it was important to gather interviews, as you can see, in many different languages, all the languages that our team could speak and understand. And then we also gathered policy documents, material about the group activities, and as I said, material from our observations and workshops. Yes. Here, the cover of the book we're talking about today is the main result for us, is the place in which we were able to draw, the most important for us, like conclusion or main points for as an outcome of the years of work and research. And if we want to summarize the 3 main issues for us is, the questions for us that we wanted to answer, and we tried to do it in this book, is what is the relationship between a right which is meant at the global level, so the rights of domestic workers have been acknowledged. Thank you, Marcella, for sharing the link. The rights of the domestic workers have been acknowledged, as I just mentioned, at the higher level. They have been acknowledged in several UN venues by international NGOs, but still, what does it mean in practice when something is acknowledged as important at the very global level and then needs to be, trickle down at the national level, needs to be implemented in a very, particular setting. So we really wanted to see what happens when a global right, as we call it, gets embedded in a specific national setting. So we do compare all these national settings and how the story went in each of them. The second point is what happens when we look at this movement, and the movement domestic workers, but we could also talk about other movements, of course, but when we try really to implement in practice from at the methodological level and the level of problematization at the same time, and intersectional lens. No? You may have heard about the perspective of intersectionality, the approach of intersectionality. We really wanted to put it in practice. And we thought that domestic workers were the ideal, let's say, case study to do so, and we will see why in a minute. And also being ourselves feminist scholars, coming from feminist debates, and also given the importance of the issue of domestic work, paid or unpaid, for feminist debates, really wanted to see if there was and what kind of connection there could be between contemporary movements of domestic workers and the feminist movements. And we will get into that later on. Yes, this is back. Okay, so I'll spend a couple of words on the first issue that I mentioned. So the tension, the relationship between the global and the local, the global and the national in our case. And this local is very much predicated, it's very much framed as being national in our study. As I told you before, we have these 10 years. 10 years, as I said, preparation, elaboration, preparation, implementation, etc. All these different steps, we decided to call that the process. So the C189, so the process behind and around and after the ILO Convention 189 was launched in Geneva. So how these set of things, set of events, of actions that happened around the International Convention have been incorporated, promoted, resisted in different ways in each country, in relation to, as we say in the slide, a wider understanding of what are the socio-economic and political features of each specific context. This goes very much in the direction of social movement studies. I don't know how much you are familiar or interested into that, but in social movement studies, you may frame something as a shock, something that arrives from the outside, somehow unexpected, or in any way it's very sudden. So this sudden external event, let's say the promulgation of the ILO Convention, had a different impact in these 9 countries, and we were able to cluster some common features in these of this impact to describe this impact in the group 1, 2, 3, and 4 that you can see. So Ecuador and Brazil, Ecuador and Philippines, Colombia and Brazil, Taiwan, India and Spain, Italy and Germany. Next slide. And this is why, because Ecuador and Philippines are 2 countries that we can see as characterized by a strong synergy between the ILO. So here we have different actors. You can imagine that as being like actors on a map, and they interact very much. It's a very intense and, let's say, harmonic, more or less, relationship between the international actor, which is the ILO, but the national government, the national civil society, grassroots movements, and domestic workers organizations. So they seem to work very well together. That makes possible for the national government to ratify quickly the convention soon after the promulgation, and also start with the implementation. They also explicitly promote the government and other local actors. They explicitly promote the importance of domestic workers, and they also promote the organization of domestic workers. Apparently, there seems to be a positive discourse, a positive narrative on the importance of this convention, what that might mean. It is important to understand this description that we make of Ecuador and Philippines has been also countries of sending migrants to work in those sectors. So very much, I mean, an important explanation of this attitude, especially for the Philippines, I believe, is also to portray themselves as defensor of the protectors of the overseas populations, of the Filipino diaspora abroad, that, as we all know, is very much active in this labor sector. Different stories in Colombia and Brazil. So the two countries with a very vibrant civil society. Please do not think about Brazil of these days. I mean, it will of the recent years. We are talking about Brazil from between 2008 to 2018. If you can recollect, these are very, let's say, positive years of progressive years of the Brazilian recent history, very much connected what usually is called the pink tide, with progressive governments, with a lot of emphasis on labor rights, on workers' rights, etc., and also labor and work as being part of the national identity. So it is in this setting that Brazil and Colombia, for other reasons, which are connected with the end of the conflict. So I would say that these actors are very active. We have a society which is very dynamic. A lot of things are happening. So the ILO Convention 189 somehow gets, you know, is one of the things that is happening. It's not the main focus of the actions of these groups. So the transformations that were involved in domestic workers somehow are transformations that concern the entire society. A progressive evolution of the position of most of the most vulnerable, stigmatized, impoverished, working class people in society more in general, Afro-Brazilians, so for example, Afro-Colombians, for example. For all of them, there was a sort of a project to improve their social position, especially their social representation. The question of domestic workers and the C189, it is very important, but has to be framed within this larger social change. Taiwan, India, and Spain are for us very painful, so to say, cases with a lot of activism, with a lot of mobilization. It's not by accident that we put as a cover the demonstrations, the demo, the picture from the rally in Taipei, in Taiwan, because domestic workers, despite all difficulties, try to be very vocal. The same would be in India and in Spain. But at the same time, from the governmental level, there is a strong resistance. We had, I mean, 2018 is already quite some years ago, but until 2018, we had a strong resistance, a sort of gummy wall against them. For us, it's important to emphasize how, if in the first and in the second category, we are talking about national workers, the third and fourth category cluster of countries, here domestic workers are what we can define aliens to the society. You know, what are defined sometimes aliens to the society, that they are the migrants with a lot of with a very little recognition as full subjects in the national dimension of the social interest. So the fourth category is actually us, Italy and Germany. Here it's a very sleepy situation, contemporary times. In today, there was a ratification of the ILO Convention, but not with a mobilization behind that. It was a more bureaucratic, probably, process. But as I mentioned before, both countries, actually, both Italy and Germany, were very active past in the former century, and so some of the rights, some of the entitlements that workers have today are thanks to the legacy of those previous movements. But because the book is focusing on 2008, 2018, for those, let's say, 10 years, for that decade, we need to signal a lack of involvement, a lack of participation, and also consensus around the importance of domestic workers' rights, which are, again, very much on the shoulders of, is a job which is very much on the shoulder of migrants. Okay, maybe, I don't know. Yeah, this is for you.
Hello. So I'm gonna try to quickly introduce you to two of the other themes that are addressed in this book, and also to give you a little bit more context about on other results of our project, which actually need to be read together with this book in our approach. So the first topic that I'm going to address, and which is addressed in the last chapter of the book, is the relationship between domestic workers' movements and feminist movements and feminist thinking. Obviously, as a let's say background question, we can mention the fact that the prevalence of women and girls as workers in this sector, and as Sabrina mentioned earlier, social reproduction, care, and affects are recurrent issues in feminist politics and debates. And in general, I think we can agree that improving domestic workers' rights is a way to contrast the stigma attached to gendered roles and division of labor. However, what we found is that at the practical level, so analyzing what domestic workers' rights organizations and organizers think of feminists in their context, we found that the feminist organizations are generally perceived by the activists as distant, although not in opposition to their cause, but somehow distant. This doesn't mean that we did not find exceptions of feminist organizations that actually have been playing a positive role as allies, and this has happened in particular. This was a case in Spain for an organization, in Brazil, in Taiwan, and in India. And if you want, we can speak more about these cases. But in general, this has not been the case. And what would happen is that mainly it has been individual women, in particular lawyers or politicians or NGO activists, who played a role of even bridging between the movements and promoting domestic workers' rights. But in terms of alliances between movements, so again, with an approach of social movements, we found a separation, okay, which is unfortunate, obviously. Here we have a quote by Geeta Menon, who is a very interesting organizer in India. And she says that attempts have also been made to create a forum with employers who have shown more concerns as of late for what domestic workers suffer. The sisterhood solidarity is evident in cases of domestic violence or when neighbors ill-treat workers, but when it comes to workplace issues like wages, leave, etc., they mostly remain silent. So we can say in these words of Geeta Menon how the issue really, and this is especially true in some of the countries we analyzed, there is a clear conflict that is between women, as in women as domestic workers, and their employers, which generally speaking are women themselves, and which in a number of countries are privileged women across lines of class, of caste in this case, of race, or ethnicity, or either minority group. What we did find, however, is that in spite of the fact that in practice there has been, as a general rule, no alliances between these two movements, at the level of discourse or framing, we did find that domestic workers' rights activists do mobilize feminist discourses in their repertoire and in their action. And specifically, we can say that this is a movement that mobilizes if on one hand you can say that the movement mobilizes primarily for and around labor rights. And, you know, as Sabrina extensively explained, the ILO Convention has, you know, has been one of the main, let's say, reasons to organize and also tools for organizing. It's true at the same time that when organizers, domestic workers organizers, fight for, let's say, salaries, you know, leave and day offs, you know, we are talking about workers who do not have very basic rights. In most countries, this labor is not recognized as a form of labor at all. At the same time, they do so in a way that tries to speak to also other forms of domestic labor, the forms of domestic labor which are not paid, and therefore speaks to the feminist notion of the valorization of reproductive labor. At the same time, while doing so, it opens, I mean, if we think about the previous quote by Gita Menon, it opens to the alliances with other women. And so the claim for, you know, the importance to recognize the value of this immense quantity of labor that goes unvalued and unseen in our societies. At the same time, they use these notions and they modify, they change it because they stress the actual conflicts that exist among women. So they challenge this idea of sisterhood because they in a very original way, they put at the center their experience as ill-treated workers of you know, of other women. This kind of argument we see is mobilized in countries such as the Latin American countries and India and the Philippines, where the workers belong, they are citizens of the country who, however, belong to extremely marginalized parts of society. There is a second frame that also is a frame that is originally a feminist argument, which we found instead in countries such as Italy, Taiwan, Spain, Germany, in which the workers are mainly migrants, therefore perceived from the outside of the country. And these are the feminist critiques of welfare and the care crisis. So in this frame that activists mobilize, there is less of a stress on class conflicts and on conflicts with the employers. There is more a general critique of the absence of state and society support for care work and the so-called care crisis. It's interesting in this case as well, the activists mobilize this frame and at the same time they modify and extend it in a way that really stresses the centrality of migration policies and migration politics in actually creating a chain of exploitation of women coming from less rich countries and being exploited in richer countries. So going to bear the weight of this care crisis. So what we found in a way is that activists use feminist frames, but they modify it in a way that can be told of as intersectional, in which okay, here there is many quotes which we cannot go into right now. But it's important to say that we use the concept of intersectionality to both study the groups who find themselves working as domestic workers, but also the kind of movements that they create and the kinds of knowledge production that they promote as domestic workers' rights organizations. And we found that they use the feminist frames and they extend it in an intersectional way, putting at the center groups of multiply marginalized women, so themselves, in ways that rarely have been done by feminists. So another way that we used intersectional lenses for has been to observe the way that these groups, so we are talking about groups that are composed and led by women with experience of domestic work, previous experience or current experience. And these are groups which face a lot of challenges because they, in terms of organizing, for various reasons. Some of the reasons have been mentioned at the beginning of this talk by Sabrina, and have to do with the fact that it is a workforce that is extremely separated, isolated, working in, let's also remember that many workers live in, so they live with their employers. These are workers who often don't have any time off. In Taiwan, for years they have been protesting in order to get 1 day off. Okay, so they are extremely isolated with no time off and with a type of work which has some elements of intimacy with the employers. Okay, so this is what they face in terms of challenges, traditional challenges of organizing. Plus, they themselves belong to multiply discriminated categories. So they face difficulties not only at work, but as women who belong to, for instance, who are Black women, who are migrant women, who are women from lower classes. So what we found is that these groups seem to, in our interpretation, do something that we called intersectionality in action. In other words, even if they don't use the word of intersectionality as such, they seem to be extremely aware of these issues of difficulties and challenges and importance of having an intersectional perspective in their actions. In practice, this means that, for instance, they are reluctant to engage in single issue mobilizations, for instance, only for the salary or for interests of specific groups such as women, migrants, but they tend to, on one hand, build new identities as organized domestic workers. And this is also in order to deal with basic exclusions from other movements. So we talked about the exclusion from feminist movement, but there is also an important issue of exclusion from trade unions in this movement. And at the same time, they create this new identity, these new groups, which always include broader issues related, for instance, to self-esteem, to anti-racism, and and they always promote at the same time, when they bring issues that are related to labor rights, they also always have an approach which is of cultural politics, we could say, and dealing with basic issues of health, of sexuality, violence, and so on. This is actually as but let's see the time. Maybe I don't remember when I started talking. So
Giulia, you have 5 minutes more.
5 minutes. Okay. So let me see, because this is okay. So I will see. No. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So what I think it's important is to stress that in our experience of doing research on issues of marginalized, multiply marginalized women, we have had an issue which you partly can, I think, see when reading the book, which is how to represent their voices and how to exactly how to not erase their experience of organizing, while at the same time, being able to theorize and think through the experience of the movements, also in order to learn from their experience for other movements. So a way that we found is to practice some forms of collaborative research, which you can find the results of in several products. One is a series of web documentaries called "Domestic Workers: Intersectionality in Action." And in a more organized version of this presentation, I would have shown you, would have liked to show you a few minutes of these materials. This is a web doc series realized along with the filmmaker Caterina Sartori, and with some of the organizations that have been involved in our research project. So in all these documentaries, which are freely accessible online, as are all the material produced in these projects. So you can find everything in open access, articles, web documentaries, books. And in these web documentaries, you can see directly the voices and the analysis of the domestic worker, some of the domestic worker leaders in these 9 countries. So as you can see, these are some of the topics that were addressed in these conversations. These actually include also the issue that was not directly addressed in our research, which was the COVID-19 breakout, which came after the end of our fieldwork, but we did decide to include it in this web documentary series. Another product that we really care about is this book in open access, produced with Open Democracy, which has a section which is called BTS, Beyond Trafficking and Slavery, which I highly recommend you to check out. We produced a book and a video, Domestic Workers Speak, in which, again, all the articles are written by domestic workers activists, sometimes in pair with a researcher or with somebody they chose in order to be able to better write the article, and that give you a good idea of the struggles in different countries. In this case, not only our 9 countries, but some other countries. An interesting theme that I haven't touched, but Sabrina touched at the beginning, is the case of Italy, which has been addressed by in a specific publication in Italian, Separate in Casa, edited by Beatrice Busi, and containing the really a series of articles on the relationship between domestic workers and feminist movements in Italy, with history and sociology perspectives, which is also I encourage you to check out. And it's it is, again, I think it is to be read together with this book. Finally, Sabrina most recently also has a book on migration and domestic work for Springer. And I think this is where we want to finish, because we can open to questions and follow your interest and curiosities.
Thank you so much, Giulia and Sabrina, of course. Thank you for this presentation. In the meantime, I was just checking whether there were some questions in the chat. For the moment, there are no questions from the students, but in the meantime, they can find all the links to the publication that you mentioned during your speech. So have a look at the links, use them wisely, and of course you can download all these documents, because they are free and available free of charge for all of you. So now we
sharing. Should I stop the sharing or
yes, of course, yes. I now invite Lucia Morosi, a member of Minerva Lab, to start the discussion. And then, of course, everybody's invited to put questions, just write in the chat. And of course, I will just manage for giving the time to each of you to speak. So, Lucia, the floor is yours now.
Okay, thank you, Sabrina and Giulia, for your very interesting presentation. As you already know, I really appreciate your work and your book. I think it's for two reasons. The first one is that domestic work is intrinsically intersectional sector. I mean, as you clearly stated in your presentation. But on the other hand, as you mentioned today, this intersectional approach to domestic work is something quite rare, especially within the Italian context, and especially among trade unions, but also social movements and so on. I want to try now to break the ice of the discussion with three questions to start. The first one is on the intrinsic concept of intersectionality in action. Which is something emerging from the everyday experience of domestic workers, rather than being a theoretical concept, I mean. And this is something very, very interesting, I think. And I'd like to ask you if you could better define this concept within the Italian context. So how this intersectionality approach is put in action in Italy, so in this contextual dimension, which are the main obstacles to it or not. The second question is strictly related to trade unions. I mean, according to you, to what extent the internal dynamics of unions in terms of decision processes, workers' representation and active role within unions can block radar analysis, also intersectional strategies and practices of unions in organizing workers, in this case domestic workers, but maybe these questions can use domestic workers as an example, but you know, it can apply also to other kind of workers, I mean. So it's possible to have intersectional practices from trade unions if they do not have internal dynamics framed in intersectional way. And the third question is on the methodology of your research. I mean, what kind of intersectional approach did you have in doing your fieldwork and your research, and in your experiences, how we can be intersectional researchers? So not only dealing with intersectional research and the intersectional objects of research, but also methodology. Yeah, and then if there is time, I will ask some other questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucia. Actually, 3 big questions, to be honest. So I would certainly give the time to Sabrina and Giulia to react. But before doing that, I would like to know whether there are other questions from the audience, students, colleagues. Just let me know. I'm just checking in the chat. Okay, not yet. Some of them, they said. I wonder whether Giulia Zacchia has any question concerning the issue of intersectionality, whether she wants to put something.
No, I was just writing that Lucia questions are so broad that we cannot add anything more. I suggest that.
Okay. But as usual, I invite the students, especially the students from Gender and Society, to interact as much as they want, since this is a unique opportunity to do that. So, Sabrina and Giulia, who would like to start? Sabrina?
I'll give it a try, and then Giulia can come in.
Okay,
And if magic happens, Daniela Cherubini will arrive exactly in this moment, and we give her the role of answering the questions. Now, okay, in order to answer to the questions, thank you, Lucia. Very stimulating, very interesting questions. I think somehow coming from another perspective, no? Very grounded probably in the Italian context. I can see your questions coming from someone who is kind of struggling, as I know, with given that kind of framework that you very kindly provided us, Sabrina, Giulia, and Daniela, what can we actually do now? So how to make it more operative, starting from our local reality. Of course, we don't have any ambition we didn't have any ambition to write a sort of handbook on how to do intersectionality in the movements. So this would be, but we are more like, if you want, as all the scholars, being critical of how the people did it, how intersectionality was done, maybe in other setting, but it's very difficult sometimes to propose alternative models, no? So again, to be on the critical side. You know, Lucia, when we speak about intersectionality, this is something that we didn't mention today because we were worried about the time, but we tried to look at intersectionality in the social movements at different levels. So one level is the level of how the, let's say, the group, or what in social science they may call the population involved in the issue, let's say domestic workers' rights, can be described in intersectional ways. So, for example, as I mentioned in the very beginning, is a population, is a social group, as actually labor, a category of workers composed by the overlap between different social groups. So it is a very mixed at the level of background, but also each specific background of these people, of this worker, has been shaped simultaneously by different types of oppression, as a woman, as a migrant, as a stigmatized minority group, etc. So this population is something that we can look at as something that Crenshaw will call through the lenses of structural intersectionality. So our structural forces are shaping the fact, are determining the fact that these type of people are doing domestic work and are not going to work in a bank, you know, or like office clerks, etc. But then we look more, so if you want, this is very structural, this is very something very rigid that we cannot actually change with the mobilization. And the mobilizations that they do are not happening at this level. The domestic workers groups are, we looked at the way they are able to address. So for example, in their meetings, do they have representatives from the different social groups that are domestic workers? Do we have enough migrants? Do we have enough women? Do we also have some men that in some countries are important population of domestic, important type, employees in domestic work? And at this level, for example, Lucia, we found that not in all countries this is happening. So the domestic workers groups, for example, in Colombia, this is one of my favorite examples, because for other ways, the Colombian groups are, I've been very active and very successful in the movement. But if you look at the domestic workers organizations in Latin America, more in general, not only Colombia, the indigenous population is missing in the organizing. While they are very active, we know, in the job, in the sector itself, especially in the capital cities, Bogota, Quito, etc. Many indigenous women from the Andes, so indigenous from the Andes are from the mountains, are coming to the big city to do this job, but they don't have a voice. They're not participating in the movement, but also they're not represented at higher levels in the movement. So, for example, we are going to look, when I say higher levels, is, let's say, what is the elaboration of the movement? What are the proposals that the movements are doing, bringing to the government or to the trade unions, for example? What are the ways they frame the interests of the groups? What are the ways these organizations represent themselves, construct their public image? Again, in Latin America, we found that some groups are very, let's say, playing with intersectionality in the way they represent themselves. They are recuperating some, female heroines of the past, so working with the legacy of colonization, of, let's say, more of the resistance to colonization, with the legacy of the resistance to anti-Black racism in Brazil, for example. So these movements, these groups are able to play with these different legacies as women, as Blacks, as former colonized people, etc., in order to construct their current identity. And it is an identity which is even going beyond the actual composition of the movement. So public image, the population, and then finally the proposals that they bring, as I said before. In these proposals that they bring are able to really pursue the interest of all the social groups that are affected by domestic workers' rights. Just to go back on something that I said before, even if indigenous women are not sitting in the meeting, in the assemblies of these organizations, even if indigenous women are not part of the image of the way they portray themselves. They very often forget about indigenous women in the way they speak about themselves. But actually, when we go and see what are the proposals that they made for the legal reforms, these proposals were actually very inclusive of all types of domestic workers, independently from their origin. So these proposals were not attached to a specific let's say, ethnicized background or social position. They would be really affecting also the indigenous women, which for other ways were absent, invisible in the movement. The opposite can also happen. It can also happen that the proposals that they, at the end, they do, without maybe even realizing that, without being fully aware of that, are actually excluding a portion of the population. This is, for example, the criticism that we make of the proposals which are emphasizing too much the professionalization aspect. So, for example, the necessity of higher educated diplomas, which we know are very important for many other reasons when we speak about domestic work and reproductive work more in general, but in practice they may tend to exclude some social groups. So in order to look at the way trade unions are impacting, let's say, they could interact with these different levels. I'm sorry if I took some time to explain that, but for us also trade unions, I mean, now I just give 3 different dimensions, but we could say how trade unions could interact with this movement at these 3 different levels. So trade unions could help, for example, domestic workers organizations to elaborate more inclusive proposals of reform. They could interact with them at the policy level, or they could interact with them, for example, in gathering more diverse populations, populations which maybe a domestic worker group itself is not able to reach out. Of course, we have also seen in those countries how trade unions were key in training domestic workers. Some more established domestic unions members from other sectors were really training domestic workers, which are very new to this activism, on the way you need to get active. I remember very beautiful interviews with domestic workers in Brazil that were really new to that. For them, I mean, the fact of mobilizing, the fact of going to assemblies, the fact of organizing meetings, the fact of even keeping the accountancy of how it works to what is the job of organizing a meeting, keeping the finance of a movement, the advertisement, the campaigns, how to make a campaign is something that trade unionists very often have taught to domestic workers that didn't have a clue how to do that. And this is a very successful example, I think. And I think that trade unions today in Italy are not doing that. At all. And this is a huge problem, because there is a lot of separation between the trade unions movement and the migrants movement or the migrants group. And since, as Giulia said before, and we also mentioned before, the fact that domestic work has become something which is a migrants' business, it is of course very true, but it's a very important downside when it comes to the capacity of building alliance, common mobilization, etc. So again, when you say intersectionality in action for Italy, your first question, intersectionality in action for Italy.
Sabrina, excuse me, just about this point that you just raised concerning training migrant women involved in care services and jobs and so on. I wonder whether in your analysis of the South American countries, you met anyway, you identified any role for the universities in this sense. I'm asking about that because, as a matter of fact, for example, in Argentina, as Minerva Lab, we had the summer school in Buenos Aires in August, and we went together with the colleagues of the University of Quilmes to one of the Becha, so one of the shanty town where most of these migrant women working in the care sector live, as a matter of fact. Migrants from Paraguay, from Uruguay, and so on. And University of Quilmes has opened a training center for giving them a chance for a better life. So as part of their third mission, as we say in Italian, but they call it estensione. I don't know whether it's called in the same way in the other countries in South America, but so I'm just curious, just in few words, I would like to know. Daniela is with us now. Ciao, Daniela. I would like to know whether you had or you experienced similar involvement of universities.
Maybe, I don't know if this is something that Giulia wants to expand on. I mean, this is a very connected for us with the role of in some non-domestic workers activists, like right, Giulia?
I was thinking, I mean, I was more coordinator for Asian countries, so I'm a little bit more familiar with those cases of our research. And I'm thinking that both in India and the Philippines, in fact, there has been participatory research projects which have been really important, in giving momentum, I want to say, to the movement, and for domestic workers to meet among, themselves, participating in workers' surveys. And I think, for instance, in the Philippines, there has been, in fact, Learn. So Learn is an organization which is a I want to say, you know, in terms of approach, a feminist socialist organization that is actually oriented to promoting, you know, training, knowledge, and both political training and actual knowledge production produced by the communities. So my answer is yes, it has been crucial for activist researchers to get involved in the movement. This, I don't know if you want to add other. I don't know whether that was the case also in Italy, maybe in other, you know, in other. I think so, but I am.
Yeah, I would say that as young scholars, especially young researchers, are very much part of the movement today and in the past. We have several figures of women, which are, of course, very often more upper class women than the domestic workers themselves, that become powerful allies, also giving them the instruments, for example, to advertise their campaigns or to consult. And I must say, for personal experience, that domestic workers groups are also actually looking for those collaborations, and they are really keen in getting more data about themselves. They need to know their movement better, and at the same time they're interested in reading and knowing more also about other countries, etc. So the academia, or let's say also independent researchers, more in general, not only academics, so to say, are really valued in the movement. Daniela, do you want to say something?
Hello, Daniela. Nice to have you here with us.
Hello, I'm sorry for being so late, but I was
no, we knew that you were busy in teaching, actually.
Yeah,
so don't
so
worry
I'm happy
about
to
that.
be here and to listen to, well, at least to the last part of the meeting. Thank you.
Yeah, we had to switch into English, as you can see, because we have several foreign students with us. So there was a misunderstanding at the beginning, and that's why we are a little bit late, but on schedule. But at least we had the chance to have you with us. So
thank you.
that was an advantage, as a matter of fact.
Thank you very much.
So any comment, any other question about what we said also as a reply to Lucia's question?
If there are no questions, I just maybe wanted to say to Lucia that when we say intersectionality in action, maybe it's not as the word may suggest, as the phrase may suggest, in a positive connotation. We are also looking at the tensions and the conflicts which are shaped between different social groups. So, for example, everything that Giulia said about the, let's say, non-alliance between feminists and domestic workers, we will see that as in intersectional lenses, no? But when intersectionality is not working towards the, you know, the coming together of different interest groups, so to say, or different social groups, but when intersectionality is helping us to say there is a distance here that could be avoided, or is detrimental to the campaign. So if domestic work as such is gathering women together, then their own positionality in terms of class, ethnicity, etc., is taking them apart.
So I have another comment then, or better, a question. I wonder whether in your research in one of these countries or in all of them, and I apologize if I am maybe misunderstood what you said today, but I mean, I missed it at a certain point. You came into a discussion of essential workers. So especially in the light, of course, of the pandemic, you said quite clearly that you were not going to speak about the pandemic today. So, but I mean, obviously, when we speak about domestic workers, care workers, and so on, we come across this important connection with the debate on essential workers. Would you like to give us some highlights about this, or? Maybe I'm totally wrong, and I apologize.
I don't know if Giulia or Daniela want to say something about that. For me, it's an important point. I've been working on this definition of essential work.
It's not straightforward, certainly.
But
for
you
the
know,
students would be very important, of course, to understand.
yeah, when we did our fieldwork, we finished with 2018. So this was not the terminology that was used at that time. The situation, for example, changed with the pandemic in Spain in particular, because the portrait that we gave of Spain as being very resistant to domestic workers movements, as being this gummy wall, as I said, on domestic workers claim. Instead, with the pandemic, they were one of the countries, Spain was one of the countries that are more effective, more rapid in giving responses to domestic workers claiming more rights. I don't know if Daniela wants to say something about it, because she has been following the Spanish case more than
Oh, yes, you well, you the point. Actually, yes, because I think that after in these last years, actually the idea of essential worker entered also in the language of domestic workers organizations. And this, at the end, we don't know if this was one of the reasons or there are other reasons, but at the end, the convention was ratified in Spain last year or this year was. So actually this was a big change after the pandemic, and yes, the situation was very different. I don't know, we didn't touch this issue, of course, during the research, but perhaps in the videos that we produced later. I don't know if you already talked a little bit about that. And so we
the Intersectionality in Action, the video.
Yes,
video. I put the link for the students in the chat as well.
So we had this opportunity to, come back to talk with the activists and domestic workers and allies, and to have a new interview with them and to produce this video. And of course, this was during the pandemic, and this was one of the topic, of course. So there's one video of the series that is dedicated to that. And we talk a little bit about that also. So this was not part of the research, but the aftermath, perhaps.
Yeah. Actually, the decision to make the documentaries was a pandemic decision, because we could not gather in person for the final conference, and we decided to produce this web series. Yeah.
Yes, I understand.
This
was the case for many projects during the pandemic, even in our case on totally different subjects, we had to produce.
And we went back to the same people, asking them a Zoom interview by then, not anymore in-person interview, but Zoom interview again.
Of course, yeah, this was the case also in our projects on different topics, yeah. So we have 4 minutes left. We are perfectly in time. We don't even need the extension of 15 minutes due to the delay at the beginning. As you can see, the students are already leaving because, of course, they leave at 6:30. So any other comment? Lucia, do you want to reply to some of the answers that you got?
No, it's okay. Thank you. I just was thinking about the distance between the gap between domestic workers organization and feminist movement. In Italy, especially, I know I studied in Brazil 6 months in 2015, and I had the chance to participate in feminist movement there, and also the theme of domestic work was more present, I think, because of I actually did the research on domestic workers from Haiti working in the houses of rich families in Sao Paulo. And it was something that our teacher asked us to do, because basically it was this focus on this topic in that years there in Brazil. And now here, I was thinking about the intersectional feminist movement also in Europe, also in Italy, but the gap is still here. I mean, it's difficult to change this reality. I think also because of the role domestic workers play, especially here in Italy, in our organization, organization of the Italian welfare regime. I mean, so it's
and the problem with the migration laws that we have.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So it's like they are very distant from our social groups. Not in my experience, it was quite different there in Brazil, for instance. And I was just thinking about this, and also about how the topic that you mentioned in your book of care commodification and marketization is often described as a way to formalize the employment relationship of domestic workers on one hand, but then on the other hand, we know it's not happening actually, and it's related to other topics, such as the one of cost containment and so on. But maybe I'd like to ask this question also, but we don't have time, so it's okay. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you, Lucia. Well, as a matter of fact, we will come back to similar topics, even if obviously it's not exactly the same topic, but in March with the paper by Valeria Cilillo concerning platform workers in the Italian labor market, we will see that with platform workers, we will find similar problems, especially in terms of the relationship with the trade unions, with the institutions, and so on, that we mentioned today for migrant workers in the care sector. And so it will be another occasion in the context of the Minerva Lab seminars to discuss about these issues. And of course, all students are invited even in March, despite the fact that the course of their courses will be ended. Keep in touch and let's keep on discussing about these important issues. So thank you so much for being with us, and alla prossima.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Ciao a tutte, grazie.
Alla prossima, arrivederci.
Bye. Goodbye.
Bye.